The night was supposed to be quiet. A family retreat, far from the noise of the city, perched on a cliff that overlooked endless darkness. The kind of place where silence feels holy, where you can hear your own breath and the low hum of your heart. But silence has a way of hiding danger. When it happened, it wasn't the wind, or the loose earth, or even the faint crunch of gravel under shoes that made her turn. It was the look in her son's eyes. Cold, empty. A decision already made. And before words could form, before the question why could rise to her lips, the push came, a violent thrust against her chest. She remembers falling. Gravity doesn't ask questions. It doesn't negotiate. It only pulls. The cliff face scraped against her arms as the world spun, sky and earth tangled. Beside her, her husband's body tumbled too, heavy and helpless, like fate itself had been betrayed. And then, through the roar of rushing wind and her own pulse pounding in her ears, she heard it, a whisper. Steady. Calm. Pretend we separate dead. That single sentence, spoken in the chaos of betrayal and freefall, became the thin thread between survival and annihilation. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes, the difference between life and death, between despair and strategy, is not strength. It is stillness, the power to slow time in your mind when the world is trying to erase you. When they hit the ground, broken, bruised, breathless, it was not the end, it was the beginning. Because this story is not about death. It is about survival. It is about what happens when the very people who should protect you become the ones who destroy you. It is about resilience so deep, it masquerades as silence until the right moment to strike. She didn't know it yet, but what began at the bottom of that cliff would unravel everything. Family secrets, systemic betrayals, even the meaning of loyalty itself. And by the end, the people who thought they had silenced her would discover the cost of underestimating a quiet, intelligent will. A single action flipped the entire outcome, her husband's whisper. Not fight, not scream, not resist, but pretend. That is where strategy begins. That is where survival takes its first breath. And so, as we begin this journey, I want you to hold on to that whisper, pretend we're dead. Because it is not only a tactic for survival in one desperate moment, it is a metaphor for something larger. The way oppressed people, betrayed people, silenced people have often had to disappear, bide their time, and re-emerge stronger, sharper, unstoppable. This is not just a story of a family's betrayal, it is a story of transformation. And here sits the question you must carry with you as we move forward. When the people closest to you push you into darkness, do you let gravity decide your fate, or do you find a way to turn freefall into flight? The fall was only seconds. The journey back will take years. But for now, remember, the world thinks they are dead. And that mistake will change everything. Every betrayal has roots. It never begins with the fall itself. It begins long before, in quiet rooms, in whispered resentments, in the slow erosion of trust. To understand that night on the cliff, we need to step back, to a family that appeared intact on the surface, but beneath the Sunday dinners and polite smiles, something poisonous was spreading. The mother, disciplined, brilliant, and deeply principled, had always believed in the power of resilience. She raised her son to be sharp, to think critically, to see the world not just as it is, but as it could be. She thought she was equipping him with tools for survival. What she didn't see was how those same tools, bent by outside forces, could be turned against her. The father, a man of quiet strength, carried the weight of systems stacked against him. He worked twice as hard for half as much. He knew what it meant to be underestimated, to be used, to be silenced, and while he carried himself with dignity, the scars of struggle left him weary. Their son grew up watching both, the mother's insistence on excellence, the father's quiet endurance. But he also grew up in a world that whispered other lessons, darker ones. A world that told him power was not in resilience, but in dominance. That survival wasn't about endurance, but about eliminating obstacles. And slowly, he began to see his parents not as guides, but as barriers. Here's what that moment teaches us. When a society feeds young people the myth that power equals control, and that love equals weakness, betrayal is not always born out of hatred. Sometimes it's born out of warped survival. The son had been changing for years, though they tried not to see it. His silences stretched longer. His ambition sharpened into something ruthless. He became fascinated with people who wielded fear instead of wisdom. And every time his parents pushed him back toward empathy, toward accountability, he felt smaller, lesser, controlled. He didn't know it yet, but what he was wrestling with wasn't just rebellion against his family. It was rebellion against himself, against the part of him that still craved love but couldn't admit it without feeling weak. And here's the cruelest truth. Systemic injustice doesn't just crush the oppressed, it twists them. It makes sons believe they must outpace their fathers, daughters believe they must silence their mothers, families believe survival requires turning inward instead of standing together. So when the push came at the cliff, it wasn't only his hands that shoved them, it was years of distorted lessons, of internalized violence, of a society that had convinced him his parents were liabilities rather than allies. The mother, broken on the rocks, replayed it all in her mind, the missed signs, the subtle shifts in his voice, the way he had stopped saying thank you. The father, even as blood filled his mouth, understood something else. Their son was not simply their betrayer. He was also a casualty of pressure, of poisoned ambition, of a system that rewards cruelty and punishes compassion. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Root causes matter. Betrayal is never just personal. It is social, systemic, generational. And yet, knowing this truth doesn't erase the wound. It deepens it. Because what do you do when the one you raised to survive becomes the hand that tries to erase you? That night on the cliff wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable collision of love, fear, power, and broken systems. And until they understood the root, they could not find the path to rise again. But survival has a strange way of teaching clarity. Pain sharpens perception. And at the bottom of that cliff, clarity began to take shape. They were not dead. They were awakening. The human body can endure only so much. At the bottom of that cliff, bones cracked, muscles torn, and blood pooling into the dirt, the choice seemed simple: give in and let the silence claim them. The wife stared at the stars, blurry and trembling through tears. The betrayal replayed in her mind again and again, her son's eyes, his hands, the push, the kind of wound that cuts deeper than flesh. She could accept dying by an enemy's hand, but by her child's. That thought alone threatened to stop her heart. The husband coughed, every breath a struggle, but his whisper was steady. Stay still. Don't set move. They think we sit or dead. We must let them think so. And here lies the fork in the road. Every story of survival comes down to a moment when surrender whispers louder than resolve. Their bodies begged to quit. Their minds screamed in disbelief. But his words planted a seed: pretend we're dead. Here's what that moment teaches us. Sometimes, survival begins not with strength, but with restraint, the discipline to not react, to not reveal, to not let pain decide for you. The wife wanted to scream, to claw her way up the cliff and demand an answer, but she didn't. She lay still. She let the night cover her. She let grief harden into something colder: resolve. The husband closed his eyes and thought of every time life had demanded he work in silence. How many times had he swallowed his anger at a boss, at a judge, at a system that thrived on humiliation? Silence had always been his burden. Now it would be their weapon. The fork in the road wasn't only about survival. It was about identity. They could die here, defined as victims of betrayal, or they could live, defined as strategists in the face of it. The son had written their ending. They had the chance to rewrite it. She didn't know it yet, but this was the first shift. grief transforming into strategy, a decision not just to survive, but to wait for the moment when silence could become power. Psychologists call this the pause of power, when the body and mind refuse the urge to react impulsively and instead create space for clarity. It is in that pause that new possibilities are born. For the wife, that pause meant swallowing rage. For the husband, it meant ignoring the pain screaming through his ribs. For both, it meant anchoring themselves to something greater than the betrayal, the belief that this story was not over. Here's the truth. Every underdog who rises faces this fork: surrender or strategy, noise or silence, rage or restraint. And here sits the question I want you to sit with. When betrayal breaks you, when the people you trusted most strip you bare, do you let despair define you, or do you turn that wound into wisdom? That night, under the indifferent stars they chose, they would pretend, they would remain still, they would live in the pause, and in that choice, they quietly began to shift the balance of power, because their son thought he had buried them in silence. What he didn't know is that silence in the hands of the wounded but unbroken is not weakness, it is strategy. The cliff had taken their bodies to the brink, but their minds had just begun to fight. At the bottom of the cliff, silence pressed in from all sides. The night carried no witnesses, only the rustle of leaves and the rhythm of their own strained breaths. They lay still, as if swallowed by the earth, their bodies camouflaged in shadow. To anyone peering down from above, they were nothing more than broken silhouettes. But stillness is deceptive. Beneath it, something was moving. The wife's mind, fractured by grief, sharpened by survival, began to trace patterns. Every lesson she had ever absorbed, every principle she had preached to her son, rose up like lanterns in the darkness. She had taught him that intelligence was more than knowledge, it was adaptability. That victory belonged not to the loudest, but to the most patient. And now, the irony cut deep. She would have to use the very lessons he discarded to outlast the betrayal he delivered. The husband, though racked with pain, carried something equally powerful: experience. He had spent years studying people, watching how pride exposed weaknesses, how arrogance left blind spots. He knew his son's ambition wasn't careful, it was reckless, and reckless men always left openings. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes, your hidden power is not a weapon in your hand, it is knowledge in your memory. It is insight into the very people who think they've destroyed you. She didn't know it yet, but her greatest strength wasn't the will to stand, it was the clarity to wait, to measure time in silence, to collect every detail, every weakness, every assumption her son had made. The father's strength, equally invisible, was his refusal to let pain steal his focus. He had long ago learned that pain can either scatter your mind or sharpen it like glass. On that ground, he chose the latter. Psychologists call this a shift into cognitive resilience, the mind's ability to frame suffering not as an end, but as information, and in that state, even agony becomes a teacher. Their hidden powers were not dramatic. No sudden burst of strength, no miraculous recovery. Instead, it was subtle. The way the wife tracked the moonlight's angle to know how much time had passed. The way the husband noted the silence above, no footsteps, no voices, proof their son hadn't checked twice. The way both of them controlled their breath, shallow and measured, until it blended with the hum of night. To anyone else, these details would mean nothing. To them, it meant survival. Here's what that moment teaches us. Power is often hidden in what others dismiss as weakness: stillness, silence, observation, patience. These are not passive traits. In the right hands, they are weapons. And beneath that silence, a seed of reversal was already being planted. Their son thought he had ended their story. What he didn't see was that his own arrogance had written a different beginning, the beginning of his undoing. The mother looked at her husband, their eyes meeting in the faint light. No words were needed. They understood survival was no longer enough. Strategy would have to be their language. She didn't know it yet, but her whisper, spoken weeks later, would shift everything, and his steady silence, his refusal to collapse, would become the quiet drumbeat that carried them toward an unthinkable comeback. The hidden powers they carried weren't grand. They were invisible, and that invisibility was their shield. The world thought they were dead. Their son thought he was free. But the truth was simpler. They were waiting. And waiting in the hands of the wounded is never empty. It is the gathering of strength, the sharpening of clarity, the silent climb toward transformation. Survival at the bottom of the cliff was only the first battle. What came next was harder, because surviving isn't the same as living, and living isn't the same as rising. When dawn broke, the light revealed the full brutality of their condition. Bloodied, battered, bones screaming with every shift, they were alive, but barely. To climb back into the world would demand more than strength. It would demand facing the very systems that had shaped the betrayal in the first place. They managed, slowly, painfully, to drag themselves into the shadows of the forest. Every movement left a mark in the dirt. But silence was still their shield. The husband leaned on his wife, and she leaned on him, both tethered to the unspoken promise, "We are not finished yet." But the world beyond the cliff was not waiting with open arms. It was waiting with suspicion. When they finally reached the edges of town, days later, clothes torn, faces gaunt, they weren't greeted as survivors. They were doubted, questioned, whispered about. "Are you sure it was your son?" people asked, their voices laced with disbelief. "Why would he do such a thing? Are you exaggerating? Confused?" Here sits what that moment teaches us. Survival after betrayal is often met with denial. Systems are quick to protect the powerful and dismiss the wounded. Their son, already weaving his narrative, painted himself as the dutiful child. He told neighbors they had been ill, disoriented, prone to wild stories. He knew how to manipulate appearances, and society was eager to believe him, because it is easier to dismiss parents as broken than to confront the truth of a child turned predator. The humiliation cut deeper than the fall itself. To be betrayed by their son was one wound. To be dismissed by their community was another. The wife, standing before officials, tried to explain through cracked lips and trembling voice. But the more she spoke, the less they listened. Her pain was twisted into confusion, her clarity into delusion. The husband, silent and weary, felt the sting of invisibility all over again. He had lived a lifetime of being overlooked, underestimated. Now even his broken body was not proof enough. Here sets what that moment teaches us. Systemic obstacles are not always walls you can see. Sometimes they are whispers that erode your credibility, doubts that hollow out your truth. And the cruelest part is this: when you are weakest, the system demands you shout the loudest. She didn't know it yet, but this was their breaking point. Not the fall, not the betrayal, but the dismissal. Because betrayal at the hands of blood is personal. Betrayal at the hands of society is systemic. And to rise, they would have to confront both. The public breakdown came quietly. One night, after yet another door closed in their face, the wife collapsed in the dark, sobbing until her voice gave out. The husband, unable to hold her through his own pain, sat beside her in silence. The world had called them liars. Their son had painted them ghosts. And for the first time, she wondered if silence had been a mistake. Here's the tension. When silence shields you too long, it begins to feel like invisibility. And invisibility, if left unchallenged, becomes erasure. That night, staring into the darkness, they realized something had to change. The strategy of silence had carried them this far, but silence alone would not redeem them. The wife wiped her tears and whispered, "If they once said hear us, then we still make them see us." It was not a plan yet, not even a strategy, just the spark of defiance in the ashes of humiliation. But sparks, if protected, grow into fire. And that fire would soon become their turning point. Every storm has its eye, a moment when the chaos breaks just enough for clarity to seep through. For them, that moment came not in a courtroom, not in a public square, but in a quiet corner of the hospital, where their wounds were still healing. The wife sat by the window, her body aching, her spirit torn between rage and exhaustion. She watched the world outside move as if nothing had happened. Cars passing, children laughing, people carrying groceries. Life continued, indifferent to betrayal. And then the thought struck her. If the world refuses to see us as victims, then we must stop carrying ourselves as victims. Here sets what that moment teaches us. The shift from despair to strategy begins with identity. Before you can change the world's perception, you must redefine your own. The husband, lying in bed with bruised ribs, listened as she spoke these words aloud. His silence had always been a survival tool, but now he understood it could not remain their only strategy. Silence had protected them. But exposure, careful, deliberate, undeniable exposure, would be their weapon. They began to map it out. Not with grand speeches or impossible plans, but with small, deliberate steps. First, they would collect evidence. The scratches on their arms, the fractures in their bones, the medical reports. Every wound would be catalogued, not as shame, but as testimony. Second, they would find allies. Not the neighbors who doubted them, not the officials who dismissed them, but quiet listeners on the margins. The kind of people who understood invisibility, because they lived in it too. Third, they would reclaim the narrative. If their son had painted them as confused, they would paint themselves as survivors, not with words shouted into deaf ears, but with stories told in places where truth could take root. Psychologists call this the shift into agency restoration. When trauma survivors reclaim even the smallest piece of control, it ignites momentum. That momentum grows into resilience. And resilience, when sharpened by strategy, becomes unstoppable. She didn't know it yet, but this shift from silence to strategy would ripple through every choice they made from here. The decision not to prove themselves to doubters, but to define themselves on their own terms. One night, as they whispered their plan, the husband said something that would anchor them both. "We don't need everyone to believe us. We only need enough truth to break his mask." It was simple, it was brilliant, and it became their compass. Here's what that moment teaches us. Turning points don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper. The greatest transformations often begin with a quiet decision that enough is enough. The wife, for the first time since the fall, felt a strange calm wash over her. Not peace, not forgiveness, but clarity. Their survival had been an accident. Their comeback would be intentional. And so, from that hospital room, fragile, overlooked, doubted, they began their silent climb. Step by step, wound by wound, they would gather the pieces of truth. And when the time came, they would strike, not with fury, but with precision. The turning point was not the night of the betrayal. It was not the dismissal by society. It was the quiet resolve that they would not let betrayal be the final chapter. She didn't know it yet, but the very system that dismissed them would soon become the stage for their return. And the son, confident in his freedom, had no idea that the story he thought he ended was just beginning again. Strategy is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or declarations. True strategy moves in shadows, in whispers, in small actions that seem insignificant until the day they converge into something undeniable. For them, the climb back did not begin with confrontation. It began with silence repurposed, no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of planning. The wife kept a journal, every page filled with details, dates, times, the way her son spoke in public, the inconsistencies in his story. She wrote everything down, even when it felt meaningless, because she knew fragments become evidence. The husband moved differently too. He listened. He observed. In community meetings, he noticed who nodded at their son's words a little too quickly, who looked away when their story was mentioned. He understood something critical. Betrayal doesn't happen in isolation, it thrives in networks. And to dismantle betrayal, you must understand its web. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Rebuilding power is not about rushing to the climax. It's about stacking small, disciplined choices until the weight of truth cannot be ignored. Weeks turned into months. They gathered hospital records. They photographed their scars. They tracked financial trails, accounts that shifted suspiciously in their son's name. Slowly, a map emerged, not just of betrayal but of motive. She didn't know it yet, but her attention to detail would soon become their sharpest weapon, because arrogance always leaves footprints, and her son, blinded by his own ego, left more than he realized. At first, the progress felt invisible. No one applauded. No one believed. Their community still whispered doubts, and officials still dismissed their words. But beneath that dismissal, they carried something more important than recognition: momentum. Psychologists call this the resilience cycle. The smallest win, even one piece of undeniable evidence, fuels hope. That hope fuels effort. And effort, repeated, creates change. The wife found her first quiet victory when she uncovered a letter, hidden in her son's belongings, that contradicted the story he had told the world. She held it in her hands, her heart racing, not with triumph, but with confirmation. They were not mad. They were not delusional. The truth was real, and it had proof. The husband found his in conversation. An old friend, long silent, finally admitted what he had seen the night of the cliff. He had kept quiet out of fear, but guilt had gnawed at him. And now, he was ready to speak. Here sets what that moment teaches us. Every system of lies has cracks, and if you stay patient long enough, truth leaks through. Their climb was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was paperwork, whispers, careful steps. It was the discipline to delay revenge until the plan was unshakable. But make no mistake, the climb was happening. And all the while, their son lived confidently, blind to the storm gathering beneath his feet. He smiled in public, shook hands, built his reputation on the myth of filial devotion. He didn't know that every smile was being recorded, every speech dissected, every lie catalogued. The parents didn't need to shout. They didn't need to fight openly. Their silence was no longer erasure. It was camouflage. She didn't know it yet, but when the moment of exposure came, it would not be a scream, it would be a scalpel. A precise cut through the fabric of lies, revealing the truth beneath. Here's the final truth of this stage. Power built quietly is the hardest to destroy, because no one sees it coming until it is too late. The silent climb was almost complete, and soon, the world that doubted them would witness the reversal. Every strategy has a breaking point, not for the strategist, but for the one trapped in their web. For months, they had collected fragments, letters, financial records, testimonies, photographs. Individually, they were whispers. Together, they were thunder. And thunder cannot be ignored. The stage for their reversal came in the very place they had once been humiliated: the community hall. It was supposed to be a celebration, hosted by their son, a polished event where he presented himself as the pillar of strength, the dutiful child who had carried his parents' memory with pride. The irony was brutal. He spoke as though they were gone, weaving a narrative that painted him both victim and hero. The crowd applauded, nodding at every crafted phrase. But then the doors opened. Two figures stepped into the room. Weak in body but unbroken in spirit, the mother and father, alive, present, undeniable. The applause faltered. Whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Some stood, stunned. Others looked to the son, their eyes widening as if demanding an explanation. And in that silence, the reversal began. The wife did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply held up the letter, the contradiction he had written with his own hand. Then, the medical reports. Then, the witness statement from the old friend. One by one, the fragments of truth stacked like bricks, building a wall no lie could climb. Here sets what that moment teaches us. Public victories are not always won by shouting louder. Sometimes they are won by presenting truth so clearly that denial collapses under its own weight. The husband, his ribs still tender, took his turn. He spoke not with anger, but with precision. He described the night on the cliff, the push, the whisper, the silence, and then he said the words that shattered the room. Our survival was not a miracle. It was strategy, and strategy has brought us here. Gasps, murmurs. The son's mask cracked before their eyes. His confident smile twitched into panic. He reached for words, but every denial only tangled him deeper in the evidence they had gathered. The crowd, once doubtful, began to shift. Doubt turned into suspicion. Suspicion turned into certainty, and certainty turned into condemnation. Here sets what that moment teaches us. The tables do not turn when you force them. They turn when the truth has grown too heavy for lies to hold. She didn't know it yet, but this reversal was bigger than exposing her son. It was about reclaiming their voice, their dignity, their truth. The community that had dismissed them was now forced to confront its complicity, the ease with which it had believed the powerful over the wounded. The son's downfall was not a single moment, but a cascade. Each document, each testimony, each scar laid bare was another thread pulled from his carefully woven image, and when enough threads were gone, the entire fabric collapsed. The wife Sepp's final words cut deeper than any accusation. You thought pushing us down would silence us, but silence is never the end. Silence is where strategy begins. The hall fell into stunned silence, not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of reckoning. The truth was undeniable. Their son stood exposed, not just as a betrayer of blood, but as a product of a system that rewards ambition without conscience. And in that moment, the reversal was complete. The parents had not only survived, they had transformed their survival into a mirror, forcing everyone present to see themselves reflected in the betrayal. And the son? His story, once polished and perfect, was now in ruins. Climaxes are loud, but aftermaths are quieter, heavier. They linger like smoke after a fire, forcing everyone to breathe what remains. For the parents, the reversal was not the end. It was the beginning of reckoning. Their son was led out of the hall, not in chains yet, but in disgrace. His eyes darted around, searching for allies. The ones who once cheered him now turned their backs. That is the cruel currency of betrayal. Loyalty evaporates the moment truth shines its light. Investigations followed quickly. The documents, the testimonies, the medical reports, they weren't just for show, they became the backbone of a case. The son, who once held the narrative in his hands, now found himself drowning in the narrative of others, prosecutors, journalists, neighbors. Here sets what that moment teaches us. Lies collapse, not just because they're exposed, but because they unravel in every direction once the first thread is pulled. But victory is never clean. For the parents, survival carried scars. They returned home, but it was not the same home. Every room whispered memory, the night of the betrayal, the long recovery, the endless doubts. Trauma has a way of lingering in spaces, no matter how much sunlight you let in. The wife struggled with this most. She found herself waking in the night, hearing echoes of the cliff, feeling phantom hands against her back. Survival had saved her body, but redemption still had to heal her mind. Psychologists call this post-traumatic growth, the process of finding meaning and resilience after deep suffering, and she embodied it. Instead of hiding from the pain, she began to write. Page after page, she documented everything, not just what her son did, but what it meant, how a community's silence hurt as much as the betrayal, how resilience is not built on strength alone, but on strategy, patience, and love. She didn't know it yet, but her words would outlive the trial. The husband, quieter, found redemption differently. He mentored young men in the community, pulling them aside, saying, ambition without conscience will eat you alive. Don't mistake silence for weakness, and don't mistake strength for betrayal. His voice, once doubted, became a compass for others. And the community? That was perhaps the most complicated transformation. Shame lingered. People whispered apologies, some sincere, others performative. But the parents didn't seek vengeance from them. Instead, they demanded something deeper: accountability. At gatherings, the wife would stand and say, "You doubted us. And maybe you thought you were protecting yourselves. But silence feeds injustice. If you want redemption, don't set to apologize to us. Protect the next voice that cries out. Believe the next wound that is shown. That's the only way this doesn't happen again." Here sits what that moment teaches us. Redemption is not about undoing the past. It is about changing the future so the past cannot repeat. The cost of victory was real. A son lost, trust shattered, nights restless. But the gain was greater. Truth reclaimed, dignity restored, voices strengthened. And in time, redemption became less about punishing betrayal and more about transforming pain into power. The parents walked differently now, slower perhaps, but grounded. People who had once dismissed them now stopped them in the street, not just to acknowledge survival, but to ask for guidance. Their story had become more than a scandal. It had become a mirror for every person who had ever been silenced, doubted, or betrayed. The son? His name became a cautionary tale. In the end, his betrayal did not secure him power. It stripped him of it. And in that, there is a deeper justice. Sometimes the greatest downfall is not prison or punishment, but the collapse of the false legacy one tried to build. The aftermath was not neat, but it was real. And in that reality, there was redemption. Legacies are not built in moments of triumph. They are built in what follows, in the lessons passed down, in the truths carried forward long after the noise has faded. For the parents, their story was never about the cliff alone. It was about what the cliff revealed: the fragility of trust, the danger of unchecked ambition, and the power of resilience born in silence. They lived on. But they did not live the same. The wife's journals became a book, not of bitterness, but of warning and wisdom. She wrote, "Betrayal may break your body, but it cannot silence your truth if you turn survival into strategy." Her words found readers far beyond her community, resonating with people who had faced their own invisible cliffs. The husband's mentorship grew roots. Young men began to gather in small circles, not to boast of victories, but to study the cost of choices. He taught them how strength without conscience destroys, and how silence, used wisely, can build. Some of those young men would later say his guidance saved them from repeating the mistakes of others. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Legacy is not about erasing pain. It is about transforming pain into wisdom that outlives you. The community changed too. Slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly, but it changed. After years of silence, people began to speak up more quickly when injustice appeared. They remembered how easy it had been to dismiss the parents, and they carried the shame of that mistake as a reminder: doubt the powerful first, not the wounded. She didn't know it yet, but the ripple of her words would save lives she would never meet. Because every time someone believed a voice they once would have ignored, her survival echoed in that act. And their son? His name faded, not into forgiveness, but into irrelevance. Because in the end, legacies are not written by betrayal, they are written by endurance. Here steps the final truth. Every one of us will face a cliff, maybe not of stone, but of circumstance, a betrayal, a silence, a dismissal so deep it feels like erasure. What matters is not whether we fall. What matters is whether we rise, and what we carry back with us when we do. Their story is not just theirs. It is ours. A testament that strategy, patience, and resilience can transform even the deepest wound into a weapon of truth. And so to you, the listener, ask yourself, where in your life are you being silenced? Where have you been pushed toward the edge by those you trusted? And more importantly, what will you do with that silence? Will it swallow you? Or will you turn it into strategy? Because here sits what that moment teaches us. A single action, the decision to keep going, to gather truth, to speak when it matters, can flip the entire outcome. This is not just a story of parents and a son. It is a story of survival, of resilience, and of justice clawed back from the edge. Their legacy is clear. The question is, what will yours be? If this story resonated with your values, if it reminded you of the power of endurance, the cost of betrayal, and the quiet strength of truth, then carry it forward, share it, discuss it, live it. And if you believe in more stories like this, stories that honor resilience, justice, and transformation, then support this work. Like, comment, and subscribe. Not for numbers, but for community, for legacy, for the reminder that voices like these matter. Because silence is never the end. Silence is where strategy begins.